would you join me in welcoming Bill Hood, who's going to lead us in the first of these now with an understanding of God at work in the global north and global south.
Well, what I'm hoping to do today is actually just tell you a story, because coming up this February will mark 10 years since I moved to California from Seattle. And in those 10 years, I've learned a few things. The first thing I learned when I moved here and started working at Concordia was don't shoot your mouth off in front of the president. Because I was meeting with Kurt Krieger and said, hey, I don't know much about the Southwest. Maybe I should go out and visit all the churches in the LCMS. Well, he waited until we were in an all-staff meeting to tell everybody that the new guy thinks he can visit every church this year. It kind of forced me to double down and take a shot at it. So, over the course of the year, I tried to get out to all 311 churches. It was a lot of work, but I learned a lot in doing it. I learned that the community in Santa Ana is different than the community in Irvine. I learned that when I went to Alhambra, the Bank of America had their sign in Chinese. I learned that there are some good people in this district, and especially when I met one for the first time, Mike Gibson, who was at Christ Costa Mesa. We met in his office, we sat at his table. He pulled out a book and said, I'm reading this book, The Next Christendom by Philip Jenkins. Maybe you should read it too. So when I got in my car, I quickly ordered it on my iPad, downloaded it there, and started reading. And it helped to open my eyes a little bit about some of what's going on in the church, globally and locally. You know, I found out that in 1990, about 90% of our country was religiously affiliated, and by 2020, that number was 65%. And as we heard earlier, by 2070, the projection is that will be 35%. Some pretty rapid decline during the years that I am here serving at Concordia. I also learned that 3,500 to 4,000 churches a year are closing in the U.S., that half of all churches did not add one new member through conversion, and only 15% of churches in the U.S. are growing, and of those, only 2.2% are growing by conversion. They're growing by eating each other, by transfer. Also learned that 60% of all churches in the U.S. worship less than 100 members, and those small churches are declining more rapidly than the churches that are larger than them. And the expected life expectancy of a church of less than 100 is less than 10 years. So there were some things going on. As I was traveling around, I'd go to the district website, I'd download the latest info on which churches to visit, I'd put them into my maps in my car, and I'd go, and sometimes I'd show up at the door of a church that had just closed. It had been so recent that the district hadn't even updated its website. But this was a repeated pattern that I was seeing. Churches that were shifting to other denominations or closing entirely. The other thing that Philip Jenkins helped me learn through that book and through other research was what's going on in the global south. Now, the percentage of Christians in the world has changed very little over the past 120 years. In 1900, 34.5% of the world was Christian. And in 2020, 32.3% of the world is Christian. During this time, Africa became the continent with the most Christians in 2018. And prior to that, Latin America took that mantle in 2014 from Europe. The perception of Christianity around the world today is that it is a white religion. Which is fair, because for the last 1,000 years or so, it was white. It had a Western history and theology, and Western training was dominant. You know, we exported that around the world for centuries. However, despite that perception, the reality is that Christianity is a majority non-white religion. Now, that's what's going on in the global south. Growth, 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 and decline in the West. But what's going on even closer to home, because I think migration plays a role in our understanding of this north-south dynamic. When we look at the top 20 most diverse cities in the U.S., California is home to 6 of them. And when we look at the number of immigrants in the U.S., California is home to 1/3. The orange bar is total immigrants to the U.S., the blue bar is total immigrants to California. Which actually is an important thing, I think, to take account of, because if you pull California out of the U.S., the only countries that have more migrants than California are Saudi Arabia, Germany, and the rest of the U.S. We are in a very interesting place here. 42% of the families in California speak a language other than English in their home, and 1/3 of Californians are foreign-born. It's a new twist on this dynamic of global south, global north. If the global south is on the rise and migration is stirring the pot, their influence is going to be felt in our communities. We also know that through demographics on those who are immigrating and migrating to the U.S., that more than 70% of them claim to be Christian. So in a country where we're seeing a decline in church, we're seeing an increase through migration that's helping us not decline so fast. One last thought here on that demographic study is that the US-born population, that's foreign-born population, was 45 million in 2015, but by 2065 it's projected to be 78 million foreign-born people living in the US. So I think it's important to pay attention to what's happening in the global south, not only because what can we learn from there that's working, but what should we be prepared for as the world shifts and as populations move, especially here in California. I recently ran across an article that had some encouraging trends in global Christianity. This was from the Center for the Study of Global Christianity at Gordon Cromwell Theological Seminary. Lifeway Research had put out some trends, and these are the ones that they identified as important. Religious faith is growing faster than the irreligious. Now, particularly in the West, it can seem like secularism is growing and people are leaving the church and the faith. Globally, that's not the case at all. Well, the number of all religious people is growing at a rate of 1.27%. The growth rate of non-religion is less than half of that, 0.5%, well below the total population growth percentage. And in particular, the number of atheists is almost stagnant at 0.18% growth per year. Did you know that now, today, there are fewer atheists in the world, 147 million, than in 1970, when there were 165 million? And that number is expected to continue to decline into 2050. Now, another point was that Christianity, outside of our local view, continues to grow. Not only is religion growing overall, but Christianity specifically is growing with a 1.17% growth rate. Almost 2.56 billion people will identify as Christian by the middle of this year, and by 2050, that number is expected to top 3.3 billion. Now, Catholics remain the largest Christian group with almost 1.2 billion adherents, but the two fastest growing Christian groups around the world are evangelicals at 1.8% growth and charismatics at 1.88%. And the dramatic growth for charismatic Christians is particularly noteworthy. In 1990, less than 1 million people around the world identified as Pentecostal or charismatic, but by 2050, that number will top 1 billion. Now, we've talked about this. Growth is fastest in the global south. The places where Christianity is growing the fastest would be Africa, 2.77% growth rate, and Asia, 1.5%. In 2000, 814 million Christians lived in Europe and North America, while 660 million Christians called Africa and Asia home. This year, 838 million live in the global north, while almost 1.1 billion Christians live in Africa and Asia alone. In 1900, twice as many Christians lived in Europe than the rest of the world combined. Today, more Christians live in Africa than any other continent. And by 2050, Africa will become home to 1.3 billion Christians, and Latin America 686 million, and Asia 560 million, and all of them have more than Europe at 497 million, and America 276 million. Now, Christianity continues to spread. As it grows in the global south, it's also becoming less concentrated. In 1900, 95% of all Christians lived in majority Christian countries. But in 2022, that number has fallen to 53.7%, and by 2050, most Christians, 50.4% of all Christians in the world, will live in non-majority Christian nations. This is an interesting one for me too here, this next one. The percentage of non-Christians who know a Christian is climbing. With more Christians living outside of Christian nations, more non-Christians know a Christian. In 1900, only 5.4% of non-Christians could identify a Christian that they knew. That percentage has risen to 18.3% today. And by 2050, 1 in 5 people in the world will know a follower of Jesus and have the opportunity to hear the gospel from them. And so as a result, the percentage of unevangelized people around the world continues to fall. In 1900, more than half of the world's population, 55%, was unevangelized. That number has fallen to 28%. A couple of other pieces that they highlighted that I think are just interesting to note is the proliferation of Bibles. Almost 1.8 billion Bibles are in circulation physically today around the world. But through our phones and apps and other resources, the Bible is available to anyone who wants to access it. And lastly, fewer Christians are dying for their faith. I think this speaks to the decentralizing of Christianity and the growth in nations that used to be very much a minority Christian nation, but now see growth in those areas. Now, there's one last piece of this story that I wanted to share today. And it wasn't that I just visited or tried to visit all 311 churches in the Pacific Southwest District of the Missouri Synod here. I also thought for the work I'm doing at Concordia, I drew a circle, 5-mile radius around this campus and said I should go visit all the Christian churches in this neighborhood as well. And on one of those days, while I was out walking around a campus of a local church, which astounded me because I'd never been on one that size, I was at Mariners. Walking through the campus, down the river, around the lake, past the bookstore and the coffee shop. And as I was talking to people as I met, one name kept coming up for me that I had to maybe take some time to meet with, and that was Christian Mungai. When I told them what I was doing and what I was hoping to do for this university within our community, they said, this is the guy you need to know. And so it took a little bit of time, but we got a meeting together. I was able to meet with Christian, and then pull together Mike, and pull together Dominic and others so that we could start talking about this global north, global south. And through this relationship with Mariners, we ended up getting involved with Kenton Beshore at that time the senior pastor, and learning about their rooted network in a trip to the Mavuno Church in Africa, where all of that started.